Welcome to this series of presentations where we're going to be looking at the prophecy of Jeremiah. It's the first presentation which I've entitled Jeremiah and His Commission. The prophecy of Jeremiah. Who was he? That's how the book starts. The words of Jeremiah, son of Hilkiah, one of the priests at Anathoth in the territory of Benjamin. The word of the Lord came to him in the 13th year of the reign of Josiah, son of Ammon, king of Judah, and through the reign of Jehoiakim, son of Josiah, king of Judah, down to the 5th month of the 11th year of Zedekiah, son of Josiah, king of Judah, when the people of Jerusalem went into exile. Gives the timing fairly precisely. He was the son of a priest, and this little village was about 3 miles northeast of Jerusalem, so he wasn't part of the Jerusalem establishment. He'd been brought up with this background of spirituality. The times when he was speaking to the people were roughly from 627 to 586 BC. Later on in the book, it says that, introducing a section, it says, the word came to Jeremiah concerning all the people of Judah in the 4th year of Jehoiakim, son of Josiah, king of Judah, which was the 1st year of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. So Jeremiah the prophet said to all the people of Judah and to all those living in Jerusalem, for 23 years, from the 13th year of Josiah, son of Ammon, king of Judah, until this very day, the word of the Lord has come to me, and I have spoken to you again and again, but you have not listened. Just imagine that. Starting as a young man, he'd been speaking to his people the messages from God for 23 years without any success. That's Jeremiah. To make sense of him and to make sense of what he said, we need to know something about the background. We're going to start by looking at that background under a series of headings. We'll look at who were the rulers of Judah, who were the kings who reigned during the period when Jeremiah was active. What was it like in Judah? What was the culture like? What was the situation like? In subsequent presentations we'll touch upon this again and again. And what was what we might call the spiritual temperature of the nation? They were God's people, descended from the people that had been rescued from slavery under the leadership of Moses all these centuries before. And spiritually they had slipped very badly, under very bad leadership. What was the surrounding political situation which influenced this tiny nation of God's people, a tiny minority amongst the people of the Middle East at the time? We interpret the book in the context of the situation of the day. There's the background map of the situation. You can see Jerusalem just left of centre. It was a time of warring empires. The Assyrian Empire had ruled. Brutal, harsh, vindictive. Their leaders had tried to take over almost all of the Middle Eastern area. Jockeying for power with them was the Empire of Babylon. For a period of time Assyria just took over the Empire of Babylon. But the Empire of Babylon started to grow again, to declare its independence and to be a threat to the Assyrian Empire. But there was also the old Empire of Egypt, ever with the desire to take over the lands to the north. and to take on the Assyrian and Babylonian Empire, but it hadn't got the strength of former days. God's people were split into Israel and Judah. The land of Israel had gone dramatically astray and had been completely overrun by the Assyrian Empire and literally wiped out of history. But Judah was left, surviving by the skin of its teeth. Isaiah had spoken to them again and again and warned them, but they didn't listen to Isaiah. The successor was Jeremiah. The people wouldn't listen to Jeremiah either. Much of that land is just desert. And so the tendency is for empires to spread in certain ways. But we had the Babylonian Empire started to take things over, and it swamped, took over the Babylonian Empire and started to expand around the desert areas and was ready to attack. But during the takeover, Egypt saw its chance, so it started to influence Judah. Israel was largely gone. So Judah was caught in a pincer movement. Egypt to the south, the Babylonian Empire coming in from the north. And the kings and the leadership of Judah didn't know which way to turn. Who was going to win? What was going to happen? Would they survive? That's the situation around them. How about their kings? King Manasseh had a long reign. During his reign, Assyria was dominant. And in order to give them some sort of guarantee of some sort of peace, Manasseh was told to pay a lot of money, stripping the wealth of the land of Judah in the process. But Manasseh did something far more serious. He reinstalled the old Canaanite religion and encouraged it, but he also installed much of the Assyrian religion, perhaps thinking he could impress the Assyrians and keep them off his back. Both these religions were very, very evil. The Assyrian religion tied in with gross brutality, while the Canaanite religion was built around fertility cults, and therefore temple prostitution became a norm, along with some child sacrifice, where infants were destroyed in the first months of their life to the gods of the Canaanites. Wrong religion can bring great evil. His son Ammon only reigned for a short time because he was assassinated by his own people, his own court officials. Not a good man, and perhaps the people felt they'd had enough. They got rid of him. And they installed Ammon's son. But Josiah was only about 8 years old when he got to the throne. So for a while other people were ruling in his place. But eventually as a teenager he took over, and he did some great things. No doubt he'd been influenced positively by good people, and he was a great reformer. He threw out the Canaanite religion. He threw out the Assyrian religion. And he had an advantage. Assyria was beginning to be attacked by Babylon and was weakening. So he had a bit more freedom to operate. But his reforms turned out to be skin deep. He could make the edicts. He could make sure that these temples of these wrong religions were removed, that the standards of behavior were raised, but deep within it, people's attitudes and perspectives were not changing. He was killed in 609 in a very foolish battle where he went against the Egyptians who thought they could use the weakness of Assyria and gain some ground. His son Jehoahaz just reigned for a few months. Egypt didn't like him, and Egypt was beginning to show its power again. So Egypt just removed him, took him away to Egypt, and installed another brother whom they thought would be more pliable to the wishes of Egypt. a puppet king. He turned out not to be a good king at all, and he led the nation astray and took them backwards into wrong religion and wrong behaviour. When he died, his son was put on the throne. He only lasted a few months, because by now the Babylonian Empire had gained in power. It didn't like Jehoiachin, so it removed him and installed a puppet king, another son of Josiah, a much younger son. And he was the Babylonian puppet king, a man of uncertainty, a man of weakness, a man who swayed this way and that. And the nation steadily fell apart. Because when wrong religion comes in and people worship the wrong things, behaviour goes astray, and the whole of society weakens, and they couldn't survive the Babylonian onslaught. And the country was flattened and destroyed in 586 BC. That's the leadership of the nation at the time. And Jeremiah was working roughly in that time period. Perhaps his dominant influence is during the reign of Jehoiakim, right in the centre. Endless confrontations took place because Jehoiakim refused point blank to listen to what Jeremiah was saying. The nation was doomed. How about the life of Jeremiah? Perhaps that's his dates of actually his life, but we can't be absolutely certain. Remember, in those days there were no diaries, no calendars. Everything was just related one to the other. And of course they had no concept of BC. Like most of the prophets, he got a definite call. And he didn't want to do the job. It's an interesting thing. Biblical prophets didn't want to be prophets. And it makes me wonder today if people claim to be prophets and think that it's something good. Are they really prophets? Prophets usually try to avoid it because it gets them into an awful lot of trouble. And poor Jeremiah suffered repeatedly in his life from his calling. Imprisonment, attack, threats, life threats. That was a way of life. Who would want that? But what he did see was, he saw through the superficiality of the reforms. Reforms that the good King Josiah had introduced. But they were on the surface. The people in the leadership class hadn't really changed. Particularly leadership class. They were in it for themselves. And one man can't change that, even a great man like Josiah. And Jeremiah saw that the nation would fall apart and that exile was just simply inevitable. Didn't make him popular. He never married. He was instructed not to do so. Perhaps his life was just simply too risky. And he seemed to be cut off from the kind of social events of the society round about. An isolated figure. Who would want to be a prophet like that? And there were repeated attempts just to silence him. Some pretty brutal. But he saw what was happening, and he saw what was inevitably going to happen. And it was coming from the north, from Babylon. When in fact Jerusalem did fall, the temple was sacked, the leadership was destroyed. Jeremiah was about aged 57 then. He was allowed to stay behind in the land of Judah. He was no real threat to the Babylonians. And 57 was quite a good age. The Babylonians had installed a governor for the land. That was their practice. And the governor was a good man. But he was assassinated by some extremists. And these extremists fearing retaliation from the Babylonians, they fled to Egypt, and they forced Jeremiah to come with them. He didn't want to go. He was now about age 60, and sometime shortly after that, in Egypt, he died. That was his life. What's a Hebrew prophet like? Here's a quotation summarizing how the Hebrew prophets, they saw themselves as the messengers of God, commissioned to convey to the people of their own day the word that God had given to them. They had a specific message to a specific people at a specific point in history. It was a message which would interpret the events through which their people were passing, or would pass, in the light of the demands and promises which God had given to their people. That's an excellent summary given by the great theologian John A. Thompson, latter end of the 20th century. We could summarize it this way. The prophet reveals the mind of God to his people, God's people, in a specific situation. That's what the word means. And if you look at the biblical text, that's how the Hebrew people saw prophets and prophecy. We're in a terrible danger today where some people are using these prophecies like celestial timekeeping, pointing to events that are about to happen now. These prophets spoke the mind of God to the people of God in a specific situation when the prophet was around. They were interpreting the situation from God's perspective and pointing out to the people the inevitable consequences of what they were doing. We must look at prophecy today that way and look at what it would have been understood, how it would have been understood, what it said to the people, God's people, at the time when it was said, because there are great principles that we can learn from today. But we must see it in its context, not rip things out of context. Poor Jeremiah faced a problem. Judah's leaders had a kind of twisted their understanding of God, and they believed in the inviolability. These things would be protected no matter what they did. Jerusalem was God's city. God wouldn't let it be taken. That's what they said. That's what they believed. The temple was the place, the center of God's worship. God would protect it and look after it. And God had promised that there would be a king to sit on the throne of David forever. So the Davidic kingship, that would go on forever. It was protected. They forgot that all these promises of God were conditional. They had reduced religion to ritual and performance. Ponder for a moment. We've been doing that in the West for generations. But it also brought in destructive religious practices. People have a right to believe what they want to believe. Yes, but there are consequences for these belief systems. And the consequences for the belief systems of the Assyrians led to utter brutality. The consequences of the belief systems of the Canaanites led eventually to child sacrifice, along with temple prostitution and the destruction of young lives of the prostitutes, girls and boys, who worked in the temple. There are consequences for wrong belief systems. But if you look at the behavior and the way life went on in the land of Judah at the time, the rich elite were doing quite nicely. at the expense of almost everybody else. The land was simply falling apart socially. Its social cohesion had snapped. And again, stop and think for a moment how much of this is true in the West over the past decades. That's what their leaders believed in. They thought they could do what they wanted because God would protect the city, he'd protect the temple, he'd protect the nation, he would protect their king. God doesn't work that way. Jeremiah saw what was going to happen. He understood that behavior matters to God. He also understood that behavior comes from the belief system that we follow. Not fashionable to accept that, but history shows it's true. What you believe determines what you do. He understood that Jerusalem would be sacked, and it would lie sacked for 70 years. He realized the temple would be flattened, totally destroyed, all its wealth removed. He understood that the Davidic kingship would not be fulfilled. Zedekiah was the last of the line before the whole thing collapsed. He needed a new kind of kingship, which Isaiah had predicted and seen before. He understood that the leadership would end up in exile. The leadership class would just be simply removed. But he also understood that the nation had brought it on themselves. By their choices, by their behavior, they had so weakened society that they had no chance of standing. They'd moved away from God's protection. If you like, they'd moved out of the umbrella of God's protection. They were exposed to take over. And the Babylonians cleaned up the mess with a lot of brutality. Now, with Jeremiah understanding that and the leadership thinking something different, conflict was inevitable, and poor Jeremiah suffered. He was honest in what he said. He stuck to his guns. But his life was threatened and on the line on many occasions at the hands of the leadership. They didn't want to hear. They didn't want their cozy system to be messed up. That's what the leadership thought was absolutely safe. God would preserve it. Ponder for a moment what did happen. When the exile came, the nation lost all three. The city was destroyed, the temple was flattened, and Zedekiah was blinded and taken into captivity. His sons were killed. After the exile 70 years later, the nation regained two of them, the city and the temple, but they had to rebuild them completely. And it took a long time. But they never got their kings back because the king was restored when Jesus came. Jesus was a descendant from the kingly line. But the nation rejected their king. Yes, some, the ordinary people, did accept Jesus, but the majority rejected their king. And the net result was the nation lost a lot. They'd rejected their king. The Romans took their land and temple. Finished, gone once and for all. Just ponder that. These are the events that actually happened exactly as Jeremiah showed they would. Why is God so concerned about idolatry? Well, you see, we were created to relate to our Creator. But it still raises the question, Why is God so opposed to humans worshipping false gods? There are people in society who suggest that God is kind of insecure. He needs our adulation. Utter nonsense. There's a simple logic to this. Look at false worship. It means we center life on anything or anyone other than God. Canaanites, it was on fertility cults and sexuality and the abuse of sex, plus child sacrifice. The Assyrian religion elevated brutality. You see, false worship leads to unethical behavior. Now that's worth pondering and looking at all religions and all political systems, all philosophical systems. The evidence that they're right is what behavior comes out of them. God wants the best for us, and He knows that if we worship the wrong things or the wrong people, we end up hurting or damaging ourselves and others. It's inevitable. It's cause and effect. That's why God's opposed to false gods so strongly. Because we end up hurting ourselves. God is love. That is not His way. Now into the text. The commission of Jeremiah. The words of Jeremiah, son of Hilkiah, one of the priests at Anathoth in the territory of Benjamin. The word of the Lord came to him in the 13th year of the reign of Josiah, son of Ammon, king of Judah, and through the reign of Jehoiakim, son of Josiah, king of Judah, down to the 5th month of the 11th year of Zedekiah, son of Josiah, king of Judah, when the people of Jerusalem went into exile. The word of the Lord came to me, saying, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. I appointed you as a prophet to the nations. Alas, sovereign Lord, I said, I don't know how to speak. I'm too young. He was a teenager. But the Lord said to me, do not say I am too young. You must go to everyone I send you to and say whatever I command you. Do not be afraid of them, for I am with you and will rescue you, declares the Lord. Then the Lord reached out His hand and touched my mouth and said to me, I put my words in your mouth. See, today I appoint you over nations and kingdoms to uproot and tear down, to destroy and overthrow, to build and to plant. Let's look at the first bit. That's roughly the time period when He was speaking. Oh, how we confuse this. Every time we see the word, we think of the Word of God and we think of the Bible. That's just simply not true. The word, translated word there, or the plural words, is the same word. And it's far more than spoken words, far more than written words. Carries the idea of an event conceptualized. And that looks awful complicated. But an event which has meaning to it. You see, language meanings have changed. Today we see words as just expressions of opinions. That's not how it was seen then, and the word here, word and event, were part of the same experience. God was showing Jeremiah insights into the meaning of events, conveyed through words. And Jeremiah was conveying that to the people. Nothing to do with the Bible as such. And he went on until the people went into exile. And that confirmed that what Jeremiah had said would happen, did happen. He got it right. Let's look at the second part. Now the words there are quite precise in meaning. The word knew, it's not just head knowledge. It expresses a commitment of God towards Jeremiah. No doubt godly parents bringing up a young boy. He was set apart. That implies set apart from other purposes. Appointed, the word implies a specific assignment. And what a task! A prophet to the nation, to speak the mind of God to the people groups of that time. What a formidable task. That was terrifying for a teenager. No wonder he said, I don't know how to speak. He was a young man. And he lacked the experience. Who was going to listen to him? The theologian John Thompson summarizes it that way beautifully. Human inadequacy and inexperience provide the occasion for divine enablement. If Jeremiah was willing to do it, God would give him everything he needed to be able to do it. And that should encourage you and me in whatever God calls us to do and be. He was guided. He was given a kind of divine authority. That's a feature of genuine prophecy. But think about it. Nations, kingdoms, starts with uprooting and finishes with planting. That's mind-blowing, because words and events are tied together in the concept of the meaning of the word word in the Hebrew language. That was Jeremiah's commission. Now God speaks to him and says, the word of the Lord came to me. That's God speaking to him. What do you see, Jeremiah? I see the branch of an almond tree, I replied. The Lord said to me, you've seen correctly, for I am watching to see that my word is fulfilled. The word of the Lord came to me again. What do you see? I see a pot that is boiling, I answered. It is tilting towards us from the north. The Lord said to me, from the north disaster will be poured out on all who live in the land. I am about to summon all the peoples of the northern kingdoms, declares the Lord. Their kings will come and set up their thrones in the entrance of the gates of Jerusalem. They will come against all her surrounding walls and against all the towns of Judah. I will pronounce my judgments on my people because of their wickedness in forsaking me, in burning incense to other gods, and in worshipping what their hands have made. You can't tell from the English, but there's a clever word play in the original language. Almond is saked, watching is socked. So Jeremiah was brought up in an area where almond trees were very common, and whether this is a dream or a vision or just a thought, we don't know. But God is watching. It were all going to happen. And in the days when Jeremiah was speaking, there was a jockeying for power between the Egyptians and the Babylonians. And eventually the Babylonians overran the Egyptians right down into the Egyptian territory. It's probable that Jeremiah would not have known exactly, and the people wouldn't have known exactly who was going to come from the north, because Assyria at the beginning of Jeremiah's time was still active. But Egypt wasn't going to be the problem. They were going to be overrun from the north, and they were. Completely and totally. Because actions have consequences. The behavior of the people in pushing God out of the central life of the nation and allowing false religion in had weakened the behavior of the nation. The leadership classes were behaving atrociously. People were suffering. The whole social cohesion of the nation was falling apart. They were weak. Their leadership was weak. They had no chance of surviving the attacks from outside. A small nation. And they were overrun. Actions have consequences. They had moved themselves out of the protection of God's hand. They had broken the conditions of the promises that God had given to them. They'd thumbed their nose at God and thought they could do what they like and that God would see them through. It didn't matter what they did, how they behaved. It doesn't work that way. And the nation was wiped out. And God's people were silenced. What a frightening picture. Did not make Jeremiah popular. The last little bit of that first chapter. The instructions to Jeremiah. Get yourself ready. Stand up and say to them whatever I command you. Do not be terrified by them, or I will terrify you before them. Today I have made you a fortified city, an iron pillar, and a bronze wall to stand against the whole land. You're on your own against the kings of Judah, its officials, its priests, and the people of the land. They will fight against you, but will not overcome you, for I am with you and will rescue you, declares the Lord. Who would want that commission? Who would want to be a prophet when that's what's going to happen? This is a daunting and indeed an appalling prospect. For a young man, that's your life destiny. What a picture. Do not be terrified by them, or I will terrify you before them. This is a real danger, because when we allow fear to overwhelm us, the others see the fear in us, and they strike at us to put us down. Oh, how often that has happened to great men and women of God. Understandable. Jeremiah has been warned. Stand firm. Don't allow the fear to overwhelm you. I'll be with you. I'll see you through, no matter what. That is also true. Down through history, great men and women of God have declared the truth that God has shown to them. And the people who resist most are the leadership classes. They influence the whole land. And on many occasions the leadership classes tried to eliminate Jeremiah. Look at Jesus himself. When the religious leaders combined with the political leadership of the Romans, they conspired together to eliminate Jesus. They tortured him publicly to death in Jerusalem to silence him. But it doesn't work, never does. But the greatest resistance will always come from the leadership class, because we disturb their social coziness. They've set up a system which benefits themselves. Doesn't matter much about the lead. They're going to defend that tooth and nail. Oh, that's been true of political empires, religious empires, and combinations between the two, and it's still happening today. That's the commission that Jeremiah was facing. What a frightening prospect for this young man to be called to that task. Having looked at the central commission, we're going to look at the central message. The message that Jeremiah brought to the people, and especially the leadership classes of Judah.